This is Chris Poland. I have the pleasure of taking you on a journey through Nepal from a broad perspective. My job is to observe community resilience and help prepare the community case studies of what happened in Nepal. As I said, it's a broad picture. There are 14 districts were affected by the earthquake. The ground motion varied dramatically, and the response of the community varied dramatically. My work was done in collaboration with Rachel Davison, professor of the University of Delaware. As you know, this presentation is one in a series of presentations that gives you the full view of what we observed in Nepal in the time that we were there by the team. My presentation is closely linked with the Lifelines presentation that Rachel Davison has done, and I encourage you to look at that for much more detail about the issues that I'm going to be talking about. Lifelines and resilience and building performance are all very key linked together. Before I get started, I'd just like to just say a few words about community resilience. It is about the community. It's a community that has the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover more rapidly from disruptions. We like to think in terms of community, in terms of its social institutions, and you can see them listed there: education, economy, media, etc. And then the built environment: energy, transportation, communications, building, and water and wastewater. The tools of resilience are performance-based design, how you design the building systems to support the social institutions, what workarounds you have in place to cover over where damage and disruptions actually occurs, and what mutual aid you have available. When I think about preparing for or observing community resilience, I really like this graphic that came from the National Disaster Recovery Framework that thinks about this as a 4 periods of time. There's the preparedness period before the disaster where you're planning, and you're going to be planning for a routine event, an expected event, which is kind of the design level, or an extreme event, which is the largest that you think you need to plan for. And then the recovery period really has a short term, which is the response that lasts for days. And during that period of time, the critical facilities, emergency housing, lifeline systems, all need to be available or quickly restored within days so that they can support the recovery of the rest of the community. If they can't be restored, you really can't get on about recovering your community. In the intermediate phase, which lasts for weeks to months, it really focuses on restoring the workforce and the lifestyle. It's about housing, it's about neighborhoods, it's about small businesses, community businesses, so that people can get back to where they can go back to work, the kids can go back to school. And then the long term is just restoring the total community. It's about economic recovery. In the Kathmandu Valley, my observation was they experienced less than expected level of shaking. Few of the communities had emergency response plans. Those that did not responded in an improvisational manner. The response was effective. By the time we were there 5 weeks later, we saw that the communities had started to really start to function again in the Kathmandu Valley. That's because the damage was really localized in a few pocketed areas that were due to geologic effects, and the disruption of the lifeline systems, as Rachel has described, was really pretty short term. Most of the needed workarounds that I like to talk about were in place already. Those workarounds had to do with having emergency generators, having the ability to store water, localize, the ability to get around the road system. Those systems are all in place because of the normal reliability of the systems that are in Kathmandu right now. And because the workarounds were in place, that really covered over a lot of the disruption that normally would affect a community in a dramatic manner. The government was able to remain operational. They were able to use most of their facilities or temporary facilities, and the NGOs that were in country providing service stepped up and continued to provide their services in the Kathmandu Valley in a very effective manner. The first order of business for the Kathmandu Valley was the demolition of the damaged buildings, and there were thousands that needed to be damaged. Their temporary facilities were quite satisfactory. Their economy is going to be affected on the short term. It's a significant impact on the economy, but not fatal. It's going to be significant impact. The agricultural economy was not heavily hurt. It'll come back in the short term. The real estate economy, which is a big portion of their economy, has been dramatically affected. Schools opened on June 1st within 5 weeks, mostly in temporary facilities, but that worked. As you saw from other presentations, the cultural treasures were destroyed, and those will need to be reconstructed. That has been done before because of previous earthquakes. And tourism, of course, which is a significant portion of their economy, has not yet returned, and that'll probably be within a year or two. The story about the villages is really quite different. The villages experienced more of an extreme level of shaking, and 80 to 95% of the damage were damaged to an extent of 80 to 95%. There were a few local response plans, and the role of improvisation was extremely important, and it really worked quite well. This is where people get up and take care of each other and figure out what to do in a fairly successful manner. The Nepal Army and Police were the first responders and did a very effective job in getting the roads clear as quickly as they could and creating access. It took a few days to a week for the NGO clusters to arrive and start providing their services, and they were still setting up, getting ready for the reconstruction when we were there. And of course, as you can imagine, out in the village areas where there was strong damage, many of the trekking facilities were destroyed. It will be a significant period of time to get those replaced. But the expectation is that the hikers will be back. Dozens of the villages had to be relocated due to landslide, and that was the biggest challenge that the district personnel reported to us as we talked to them. The good thing about the villages is they really are a self-sustaining group of people, millions of them. They were building their own interim shelters. There's some examples here to protect themselves from the coming monsoon seasons. There was 15,000 rupees made available from the government to anybody that had a destroyed home to buy the metal panels that were the most prevalent being used in the reconstruction. Only 70%, I should say only 70% of the roads are now cleared, 30% still are not cleared, and that process really has left many of the very distant villages in a state of remoteness and not really benefiting from the services, the restoration services that are available. The water sources were destroyed, but the water tank trucks were running and able to deliver water, and the communication was working. Their agricultural economy, similar to the Kathmandu Valley, was not seriously affected, and it will be able to be restored in a couple of years. Interestingly enough, in the villages we heard that they had food. There was not a problem with food because they have their agricultural economy and the stockpiles that they had. Rebuilding is underway. The government has recently issued their post-disaster needs assessment. It's an extraordinarily good plan that describes the extent of damage across the country and what needs to be done. And then the whole process of men leaving Nepal and working in foreign countries and sending the money back as remittances continues, and that is a very important part of their economy that will continue to sustain Nepal. I'd like to suggest that there's a number of opportunities within the built environment where Nepal could focus on doing some things that would make them a more resilient community. First thing has to do with housing, and you can refer to the presentations on building damage for more information about this. But the bottom line is that when they restore their building code, when they redo their building code and start reconstructing, they need to construct to a shelter-in-place standard. This is a standard that allows people to continue to occupy their homes after an event occurs like this, even though the utilities might not be available, but the buildings are safe. And they also need to replan for the next event, replan their communities, do a significant amount of urban planning so that there's appropriate access, open space, and egress. The construction process in Nepal is a little bit free-form, and this has been explained in other presentations. But the bottom line is that the owners need to embrace the value of the building code, and I honestly don't know how we need to do this. This is a problem that we have all over the world, honestly, where owners don't believe they need to follow the building codes, and when they're given the opportunity to not follow the building codes, they don't. But we need to instill in owners the need to do that. Contractors need to be trained and licensed to construct properly. The time-honored tradition of allowing contractors to build the way they are trained is fine most of the time, but for these high-impact, low-probability events, contractors need to be trained on how to build for situations that they haven't seen yet. And then all construction should undergo plan review and inspection. You just can't get things built properly unless you're reviewing the designs and inspecting the work. As far as transportation goes, you've heard the stories about the roads and the priority that was given. What they really would help themselves a lot if they would build wider roads and wider roads so that you can have some landslide, you can have some disruption, some buildings collapsing in the roads and still get by, have 2 cars able to pass, and then have redundant routes into the villages and into the lifeline systems. And that's a tall order, but it's one that would help to renew resilience. As far as the airport goes, the recommendations there have to do with updating an old airport facility. It was an older facility. It had an old runway. It had limited capacity. It had a complete emergency response plan, but it really didn't have built into the response plan, best I could tell, what the workarounds were going to be. And because you've got to have your airport, especially in that country, because that's the main source of bringing in emergency supplies. So they need to update their plans and increase the capacity of their runway, upgrade the runway, provide additional emergency parking. They only had 9 stalls available to park planes to unload them. And they also need to make better use of the domestic airports as a way of expanding capacity for the emergency response supplies to be brought into the country. As far as communication goes, I've already mentioned that it came back online quite quickly. The Lifelines presentation gives all the details about this. There is quite a large number of vulnerable towers that are out there, vulnerable to landslides and strong shaking, and those would do well to be retrofit. And then adding even more redundancy to the system could help. But this is way down the list for Nepal, because that cell phone system seems to be working quite well, and they really benefit from the fact that most everybody has a cell phone, and it relies on the radio waves. It doesn't rely on the towers and the wires. As far as electricity, you've heard that the electricity system was restored, and they're doubling their capacity. They need to make sure they're designing a robust system, and that's a system that's strong enough, that's not damaged, that can continue to operate in most areas immediately after the strong shaking, and they need to add redundancy to their transmission and distribution systems. Their critical facilities, these are the hospitals, emergency operations centers, government facilities, police and fire stations. Those buildings are needed immediately after the strong shaking stops, and they really need to be designed and retrofit so that they're usable. In Nepal, they need to take a look at those critical facilities as a group, determine the vulnerabilities, plan for temporary operations, what they're going to do the next time when some of those facilities are not available, and then get on about the business of retrofitting and replacing them as possible, especially as they're doing their capital improvement plans. The water system is in transition. They're transitioning from a well-based system in Kathmandu, and they have this, of course, in the villages, to a more centralized system where they're distributing water that's clean. It needs to be designed, as they're doing this expansion, for robustness, and they really need to get about recharging their groundwater system. Wastewater treatment, as you know, the sewage is discharged into the rivers. They're in the process of building a new network of treatment plants, and those treatment plants really need to be designed to remain operational, and they need to be designed for robustness. It's not good enough to design it so that people are safe in them. They really need to be designed to be operational. So we take those lessons that we observed, and then the recommendations we made about improving the resilience of a country that really behaved in a fairly resilient manner because they had their workarounds in place, and they had a culture of people who really understood what it meant to take care of themselves under adversity, and bring that home. And what can we say about that? And I'd like to observe that resilience really needs to begin with saving lives. The conversation about resilience generally doesn't talk much about dangerous buildings and saving lives, but it should. For all the good that we observed in Nepal, they still lost 9,000 people. And when they rebuild better and they rebuild housing that can shelter in place, they will save many, many lives. And of course, the life loss that they experienced in Nepal was really very low compared to what the potential was, because of the day it occurred on their day off on Saturday, and because of the time of day. It occurred at noon when most people were outside. You need to have emergency access to get to people and to get to critical facilities, and that's a key thing for our communities in the United States to think about. What condition are the roads in? What condition are the bridges in? But where are the debris sources going to occur? What's going to be blocked, and how are you going to get to people in critical facilities? Of course, you've got to have proper performance-based building codes and inspection for compliance. I wish I could say we had that throughout the United States, but we don't. All communities need to adopt proper codes and inspect for compliance and do plan check. Distributed lifeline systems, naturally more resilient. We observed that in Nepal. It's something we're talking about in the United States. We should be moving in that direction. And then we need to understand what our communities' wide recovery vulnerabilities are, conceptualize our workarounds, and plan for mitigation whenever it's possible. That allows us to do a lot of work and do a lot of planning that allow us to be resilient because of those workarounds, even though we can't afford to do all the mitigation. In 50 to 100 years, we'll have it taken care of. But before that, we're really going to be great. There'll be great benefit by conceptualizing and planning for those workarounds that we have. So the community case studies that were promised are yet to come. We'll select communities. We'll do some longitudinal studies over the next couple of years and summarize those observations and give a long observation process to how communities did. It's going to bring us more information. We'll learn more from that. We're going to be paying close attention to the level of pre-earthquake planning, what happened during the earthquake, what did recovery in the various sectors proceed, how did it proceed, how were decisions made, where did the resources come from. All these questions will be addressed in the community case studies. So there were a few reports that I depended on, and to do this, the most important one is this Nepal Earthquake 2015 Disaster Needs Assessment Executive Summary, produced by the government of Nepal. Is a very, very excellent overview of what happened in Nepal, what needs to happen for the reconstruction, and what kind of resources are necessary, and where they hope that those resources are going to come from. There's more information about the earthquake available on the EERI's Virtual Clearinghouse website, and that will continue to expand as the months go by. There's data, there are reports, there's photographs. The data is geolocated, so you can tell where it comes from. It's going to give us a great opportunity to think about where the concentrations of strong shaking are and where the damage was, and go farther than just kind of lumping everything together into a single observation about an entire country. I'd like to thank my virtual team collaborator, Martha Kuenka, who did research for me before I went and uploaded photos to the EERI map. A tremendous team of virtual collaborators was put together to support our team. And then I'd also like to acknowledge the support from the National Science Foundation for my particular travel, because I was working on the Resilient Observatory project, from the EERI Learning from Earthquakes program for logistics support, from NSET, the local Nepal agency that focuses on earthquake engineering and preparedness, for their help with coordination, logistics, translation. They kept us organized and kept us moving around Nepal so we could observe as much as literally possible. And then to my team members for all the discussion and intellectual stimulation and all that we had before, during, and now after the earthquake as we're distilling the results. I've already mentioned that Rachel Davison was an important member of my sub-team. We worked together on lifelines and resilience, and it was important. She was an important resource of information for this. And I'd also like to acknowledge Rob Oshansky and Laurie Johnson, who are the co-leads of the EERI Resilience Observatory project, and provided me with this opportunity to join in this Lifelines team on their behalf, and to report back to the Resilience Observatory my findings.